Centuries before Darwin published a single word about evolution, the people of the Malay archipelago looked up into the trees, saw those long, red arms reaching between the branches, and gave that creature a name that translates directly as person of the forest. They were not being poetic. They were being precise. This is the story of how a word born in the jungle ended up in every biology textbook on Earth. To understand the word orangutan, you have to understand the world it came from. We are talking about the rainforests of Borneo and Sumatra, some of the oldest and densest ecosystems on the planet. The Malay language had been developing in this region for well over 1,000 years by the time European explorers arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was a sophisticated trading language, a lingua franca across island Southeast Asia, and it had very precise vocabulary for the natural world that surrounded its speakers every single day. The Malay-speaking peoples were not a simple or isolated culture. They had trade networks stretching to China, India, and the Arab world. They had written literature and legal codes, and they had, living in the forests just beyond their villages, these enormous reddish-lit apes that moved through the trees with an almost unsettling deliberateness. Slow, thoughtful, disturbingly familiar in their movements. So the Malay speakers did what humans always do. They named what they saw, and the name they chose was Orangutan. Orang means person. Hutan means forest. Person of the forest. Origin story. The compound Orangutan in Malay is built from two completely ordinary words. On its own, orang simply means person or human being. You still see it in modern Malay and Indonesian in words like orang-orang, meaning people, or in place names and social titles across the region. Hutan means forest or wilderness, specifically the kind of dense, uncultivated jungle that sits outside settled land. Put them together, and you get a description that is almost clinical in its directness. This is the creature that lives as a person lives, but out there, in the forest. The earliest confirmed record of the word entering written English dates to 1973 in formal etymological records, but the creature and its name had been circulating in European natural history writing for much longer. Dutch colonists in the East Indies were among the first Europeans to document the animal in any systematic way. Jacob de Bont, a Dutch physician working in Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta, wrote about the orangutan in manuscripts completed around 1631, though they were published posthumously in 1658. De Bont recorded both the animal and something very close to its Malay name, and his descriptions introduced the creature to European scientific audiences. He was genuinely astonished by the animal's resemblance to human beings, and he did not hesitate to say so in his writing. A few decades later, in 1609, the English buccaneer and naturalist William Dampier published accounts from his travels in Southeast Asia and mentioned large apes in ways that contributed to growing European awareness. But it was the Dutch naturalist Nicolaas Toop, famous in art history for Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson, who in 1641 published what is considered one of the first European scientific descriptions of an ape from this region, likely an orangutan, under the Malay-derived name. The word was already doing its work, carrying the indigenous knowledge of Malay speakers directly into European scientific Latin. By the time Carl Linnaeus was building his taxonomic system in the mid-1700s, the word orangutan was well established in European natural history literature. Linnaeus himself used a version of it in Systema Naturae. The Malay term had made the full journey from a name used by forest-edge communities in Borneo and Sumatra through Dutch colonial manuscripts into the formal Latin taxonomy of Western science. The misconception. Here is where people get the story backwards. The common assumption is that calling an ape a forest person is somehow a quaint or naive confusion, something pre-scientific people believed before we knew better. Or, in a more flattering version, people assume the name is a kind of poetic folk wisdom that happened to anticipate Darwin's insight about shared ancestry. Neither of those readings is quite right. The Malay speakers who coined orangutan were not making a claim about evolution. They were making an observational classification. They saw an animal that walked upright some of the time, used its hands with remarkable skill, showed what looked like deliberate problem-solving behavior, and lived a largely solitary but socially aware life. Given all of that, person of the forest was a reasonable descriptive category. It was taxonomy by behavior and appearance, which is actually not far from what early Western naturalists were doing in their own way. What matters is the timeline. This name predates Darwin's On the Origin of Species by centuries. It predates the whole Western framework of evolutionary biology, and yet the classification it encodes this thing as person-like turned out to be scientifically accurate. Orangutans share roughly 97% of their DNA with humans. They are among our closest living relatives. The Malay speakers got there not through genetics, but through sustained, careful observation of an animal they lived alongside for generations. Modern echoes. The word today sits in a fascinating position. In conservation biology and wildlife protection law, orangutan is the official common name for two species, Pongo pygmaeus from Borneo and Pongo abelii from Sumatra, with a third species, Pongo tapanuliensis, formerly described as recently as 2017. Every international conservation document, every wildlife trafficking law, every zoo exhibit in the world uses this word, and they are all, without necessarily knowing it, using a Malay descriptive phrase coined by indigenous forest edge communities. In Malaysia and Indonesia themselves, the word still functions in both its original linguistic sense and its scientific one. Indonesian schoolchildren learn orangutan as both a vocabulary lesson in their own language and as a biology term. The layers are completely transparent in a way they are not in English. When an Indonesian speaker says orangutan, they hear forest person without any effort at all. The etymology is not buried. It is just the sentence. Deeper connections. The path this word took reveals something interesting about how scientific vocabulary actually forms. It does not always start in Greek or Latin. Sometimes it starts with a community of people who have been watching something carefully for a very long time. The Malay root orang connects to a broad family of Austronesian language concepts around personhood and social identity. Hutan connects to concepts of uncultivated outside space, land that belongs to no settlement, which parallels the Latin silva, meaning wild woodland, and interestingly mirrors the etymology of the English word forest itself. The word forest comes to English through Old French forest, and before that from medieval Latin forestem silvam, meaning the outside woods. This phrase appears in the Capitularies of Charlemagne, the legal documents of his empire, where it referred to royal hunting grounds kept separate from settled land. The outside quality is built right into the Latin root. So both forest and hutan carry this idea of wild, exterior space defined by its distance from human settlement. The orangutan's name essentially doubles down on that concept. It is the person of the outside place. There is also a broader pattern here in how colonialism moved indigenous vocabulary into Western science. Words like jaguar, iguana, toucan, situat, and piranha all followed a similar route from the naming practices of communities who actually lived with these animals into the notebooks of European naturalists, and from there into formal taxonomy. The difference with orangutan is that the indigenous classification turned out to be almost perfectly aligned with what molecular biology would confirm 3 centuries later. That is not a coincidence. It is what happens when careful observation gets taken seriously. Visual.